My name is Derek Wyatt, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in October 2022, during what was supposed to be just another trip for my YouTube channel, Urban Myths Unmasked. My shtick is simple. I visit locations with creepy legends, spend the night there, and debunk the so-called hauntings or sightings with a heavy dose of sarcasm and logic. It's a winning formula. My audience loves it. But Jenny Jump State Forest in New Jersey? That place was different, and I'll never go back. I pulled my RV into the small lot near the trailhead, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the towering trees. With me were my girlfriend Mia and my best friend Ryan. Mia is 28, the level-headed one, always asking me to be respectful when I mock these legends. Ryan, 29, is the wild card. Loves a good scare but can't handle being alone in the dark. They'd both been on countless trips like this, but the tension in the air that day felt different. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, or the absence of other hikers on what should have been a busy autumn weekend. "Jenny Jump," I said, slinging my camera onto my shoulder. "You gotta admit, the name's ridiculous." "It's literally named after a dead girl," Mia shot back, already annoyed with me. "Allegedly dead," I corrected. "No proof she even existed. It's just a story people made up to spook tourists." Ryan was standing by the trail map, squinting at the faded letters. "Dude, this place is massive. We're sticking to one trail, right? I don't want to get lost." "Relax," I said, clapping him on the back. "We've got GPS, flashlights, and a whole forest to ourselves. What could go wrong?" We set up camp a mile in, near a clearing with a decent view of the cliffs. The legend goes that Jenny, a young girl, was chased by something, some say a witch, others say an inhuman entity, and jumped to her death to escape. I planned to film a dramatic monologue at the cliff's edge, mocking the story while the sun set behind me. But first, we had to settle in. Ryan was already fumbling with the tent poles while Mia collected firewood. I set up the cameras, grumbling as the batteries drained faster than usual. "That's weird," I muttered. This one was fully charged. "It's the cold," Mia said, stacking logs near the fire pit. "Batteries drain faster in cooler temps." I shrugged it off and turned the camera to face me. "Welcome to another episode of Urban Myths Unmasked," I began, my voice loud enough to echo through the trees. "Today we're diving into the creepy legend of Jenny Jump, a tale so full of holes it might as well be Swiss cheese." The first sign of something off came as the sun dipped below the horizon. Mia froze mid-step, her head cocked like she was listening to something. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" I asked, but then I caught it. A faint, desperate voice, carried on the wind. It was barely audible, but it sounded like a young girl pleading, "Help me." "Probably just the wind," I said, brushing it off, though I felt a chill creep up my spine. Mia shot me a look. "You can't seriously think that was the wind." "Fine," I said, grinning. "It's probably some tourist kid messing with us." Ryan, who'd been poking at the fire, stood abruptly. "Yeah, let's not joke about that, okay?" The night deepened, and with it came a sense of unease. Shadows danced just beyond the firelight, and the forest grew unnervingly quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Mia suggested turning in early, but I wanted to explore a bit more. That's when we noticed the trail markers were gone. "They were right here," Ryan said, spinning in place. "I saw them on the way in." "Probably just overlooked them," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I clicked on my flashlight and pointed it down the path. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were barefoot, but the toes were twisted, splayed out in ways that didn't look human. "Mia, check this out," I said, motioning her over. Her face went pale as she inspected the prints. "These aren't normal." I was about to respond when a faint rustling sounded behind us. Spinning around, we shone our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing, just shadows. We decided to call it a night. Ryan zipped himself into his tent with the speed of a man who didn't want to see what was outside. while Mia and I sat near the fire in uneasy silence. "I'm serious, Derek," she said after a while. "This place doesn't feel right." Yeah, I said, waving her off. "You always say that." "I mean it," she insisted. "It feels like we're being watched." I laughed nervously. "It's just your imagination." But deep down, I knew she wasn't entirely wrong. There was something oppressive about the forest now, as if the air itself had grown heavier. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the flap to find Ryan standing there, his face pale as a sheet. "I heard you calling me," he said, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "I didn't call you." Ryan's eyes darted to the trees. "It sounded just like you. You said my name over and over." Before I could respond, Mia's scream cut through the night. We sprinted to her tent and found her standing outside, shaking. "I saw her," she whispered, her eyes wide. "A little girl, standing at the edge of the cliff. She was smiling." Panic set in. We decided to pack up and leave, but the path back to the RV was nowhere to be found. Our GPS devices showed only static, and every trail we followed seemed to loop back to our campsite. The forest was toying with us. Then it showed itself. It stepped out from the shadows, a pale, elongated figure with hollow black eyes. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't walk. It skittered, like a spider learning to stand upright. "What the hell is that?" Ryan whispered, his voice cracking. The thing tilted its head as if studying us. Then it spoke, in my voice. "Run," it said, grinning with a mouth full of sharp, uneven teeth. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush with no sense of direction. The thing followed, always just out of sight but close enough for us to hear its ragged breathing. Ryan tripped and fell, and when I turned to help him, I saw the thing crouched over him, its fingers clawing at his jacket. I screamed and threw a rock, hitting it square in the chest. It hissed, a guttural, bone-chilling sound, and retreated into the trees. Ryan was shaken but unharmed. "What the hell is that thing?" he panted. "Something we shouldn't have messed with," Mia said, her voice trembling. Desperate, Mia remembered reading about leaving offerings for spirits. We gathered what little food we had and placed it at the base of a tree near the forest's edge, then walked backward, never turning our backs on the woods. The entity watched us the entire time, its hollow eyes unblinking. When we finally reached the RV, the sun was rising. The forest seemed to sigh, releasing us from its grip. The footage we captured was useless, static, and distorted images of shadows and trees. But one frame stood out. A clear shot of the entity standing just behind me, its empty eyes staring directly into the camera. I haven't gone back to Jenny Jump since, and I never will. Some legends, I've learned, aren't meant to be debunked. My name is Evelyn Monroe, but everyone calls me Evie. I'm 35 years old, and this happened last October during a solo RV camping trip to Wharton State Forest in New Jersey. I wasn't just there for fun. I was working on a feature for Wanderlust Weekly about haunted camping destinations. And if I'm being honest, it was also a chance to confront something I'd been avoiding for over a year: my fear of being alone in the wilderness. I used to love hiking and camping, but after my younger brother Liam died in a hiking accident, everything changed. He was only 29. We'd been inseparable growing up, and the guilt I carried from his death was like a lead weight in my chest. Writing about the outdoors was my way of staying connected to it, but I hadn't actually gone on a solo trip since Liam passed. I told myself this assignment would help me heal. I didn't expect it to nearly destroy me. I arrived at Wharton State Forest on a crisp Friday afternoon, parking my RV near Atzian Lake. The Pine Barrens were beautiful, all golden leaves and cool autumn air. But even in the daylight, the forest felt heavy. The kind of quiet that wasn't calming, but unsettling. I brushed it off as nerves and started setting up my campsite. Everything was going fine until my generator quit. 1 minute it was humming along and the next, it sputtered and died. I cursed under my breath and tried restarting it, but it wouldn't turn over. "Guess it's a low-tech weekend," I muttered, grabbing my flashlight and camera to document the area. The light was already fading, and I wanted some good shots before it got too dark. That first night, I stayed close to the RV. My campfire flickered in the cool breeze as I scribbled notes in my journal. I wasn't scared, yet. But then I saw it. At first, I thought it was another camper, maybe someone night hiking with a lantern. A soft golden light bobbed through the trees, moving slowly toward me. I stood and waved. "Hey," I called out. "You lost?" The light stopped. "Hello?" I called again. My voice echoed, then faded into silence. The lantern blinked out like someone had snuffed it. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, but told myself it was nothing. Probably just another camper being weird. I shrugged it off and climbed into the RV, locking the door behind me. The next day, I explored deeper into the forest. I found an overgrown trail that wasn't on my map and decided to follow it, thinking it might make for an interesting anecdote in my article. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal hands. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten, untouched by time. About an hour in, I noticed something glinting in the dirt. I crouched down and picked it up, a compass. Its casing was rusted, and the glass was cracked, but it looked eerily familiar. My chest tightened as I realized why. It was identical to the one Liam used to carry. "No way," I whispered, turning it over in my hands. The odds of finding a compass like this, here of all places, it had to be a coincidence. But it didn't feel like one. I slipped the compass into my pocket and headed back to camp, trying to shake the uneasy feeling growing in my gut. By the time I returned, the sun was setting, painting the sky in deep orange and purple. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. Barefoot, with toes spread wide like they belonged to someone who'd never worn shoes. They led from the edge of my campfire to the RV door. That night, the whispers started. At first they were so faint I thought it was the wind. But as the hours dragged on, they grew clearer, like voices just out of reach. They said my name. "Evie, Evie, come back." I pressed my hands over my ears, heart pounding. "This isn't real," I told myself. "It's just your imagination." But when I opened my eyes, the lantern was back. It floated in the trees, closer this time, and behind it, a shadowy figure. "Who's there?" I shouted, grabbing my flashlight. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, holding the lantern high, as if waiting for me to follow. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, but I couldn't. I stepped closer, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The figure retreated, the lantern drawing me deeper into the woods. I don't know how far I followed it. The trail became rougher, the trees closing in around me. Then the light vanished, and I was alone. Panic set in. I turned back the way I'd come, or tried to. The forest didn't look the same. My flashlight flickered, then went out completely. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me. "Evie, it's your fault. You left me." Tears streamed down my face as the voice became unmistakable. It was Liam. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "You're not real." But then he appeared. He looked just like he had the last time I saw him. Messy brown hair, hiking boots, that stupid grin. He held the compass in his hand, turning it over like he was inspecting it. "You left me," he said, his voice hollow. "Why didn't you save me?" I fell to my knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," I choked out. "I'm so sorry." He stepped closer, the light of the lantern illuminating his face. But as he moved, his features began to change. His grin stretched too wide. His eyes turned black, and the compass in his hand began to glow. The lantern man loomed over me, his lantern casting flickering shadows. I tried to move, but I couldn't. He pointed deeper into the woods, where the whispers were louder than ever. "Come," he rasped, his voice a dry wind. "See what you've done." "No!" I screamed, scrambling backward. "You're not real!" He tilted his head, almost amused. The compass in my pocket burned against my skin, and I realized it was the key. He was feeding on my guilt, using Liam's memory to trap me here. I tore the compass from my pocket and threw it into the darkness. The whispers stopped, and the lantern man let out a guttural scream, his form flickering like a dying flame. I ran, not caring where I was going, only that I needed to get away. Somehow I made it back to the RV. The forest seemed to sigh, releasing me from its grip. I didn't stop to think. I started the engine and drove until the trees thinned and the highway came into view. The next morning, I found the compass in my bag, completely intact. I threw it into the nearest river. I didn't write about the lantern man for Wanderlust Weekly. Some things are better left untold. But I'll never forget the Pine Barrens, or the weight that lifted when I let go of my guilt. Maybe the lantern man was just a legend, but I know what I saw, and I know I'll never go camping alone again. My name is Sam Gallagher, and I'm 38 years old. This happened last October, when I decided to take my RV to Clinton Road in New Jersey for a weekend camping trip. I was working on a book about America's most haunted locations, blending photography and storytelling to debunk myths about the supernatural. At least, that's what I told myself. Deep down, I think I was trying to escape the guilt I carried after my divorce, and the distance it created between me and my 14-year-old daughter, Rachel. I thought Clinton Road would be like the other places I'd visited. Eerie, sure, but nothing that couldn't be explained by science or a healthy imagination. I was wrong. I parked the RV at the edge of a secluded trail, far from the main road. The forest here was dense, the kind of place where sunlight struggled to reach the ground. It felt ancient, heavy with secrets. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves. I'd read plenty about Clinton Road's reputation. Ghosts, witches, strange creatures. It was a paranormal buffet. Perfect fodder for my book. By late afternoon, I was wandering the woods with my camera, snapping photos of gnarled trees and moss-covered rocks. The light was perfect, golden and soft, but the air felt wrong, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. That's when I noticed the crows, at least a dozen of them, circling overhead. Their sharp cries broke the stillness, sending chills down my spine. I trained my camera on them, but before I could snap a shot, they scattered. I lowered the lens and froze. Carved into the tree in front of me were strange symbols. Spirals, crosses, and jagged lines. They looked old, really old, and eerily deliberate. One symbol stopped me cold. Two intersecting lines with what looked like my daughter's initials, RG, scratched below. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe a trick of the mind. I snapped a photo, telling myself I'd research it later. But I couldn't shake the thought that it was a warning. That night, as I sat by the campfire reviewing my photos, I heard it. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, calling my name. Sam. I looked up, scanning the trees with my flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Sam. The voice was closer now, almost a whisper. It was calm, familiar, and completely unnerving. "Who's there?" I called, standing. The only response was the crackle of the fire. I tried to laugh it off as my imagination, but my hands were shaking as I turned back to the RV. That's when I saw her. A woman stood just beyond the firelight, cloaked in shadows. Her face was hidden, but her presence was undeniable. I grabbed my camera and snapped a photo, but when I lowered it, she was gone. The next day I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Lack of sleep, too much caffeine. It was easy to explain away. But the symbols in the photos, those were real. I spent the morning following more trails, hoping to find similar carvings. I did. Dozens of them, etched into trees, rocks, even the ground. They seemed to form a pattern, leading me deeper into the forest. By midday, I reached a small clearing with a stagnant pond at its center. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the crows were back, perched silently in the branches above. That's when I lost time. I remember crouching to take a photo of the pond. The next thing I knew, the sun was low in the sky, the golden light replaced by an eerie twilight. My watch said it was only noon, but the shadows said otherwise. "Damn it," I muttered, slinging my camera over my shoulder. As I turned to head back, I saw her again. She was standing across the pond, her cloak blending with the shadows. Her eyes, red and glowing, locked onto mine, and I felt rooted to the spot. "You should have stayed," she said, her voice echoing in my head. I blinked, and she was gone. By the time I stumbled back to camp, the sun had set. I locked myself in the RV, heart pounding as I reviewed the day's photos. One image stopped me cold, a reflection in the pond. It wasn't me. It was her. The fire outside crackled, though I hadn't lit it. I peered through the window and saw a figure sitting by the flames. It was Rachel. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "Help me." I bolted outside, but when I reached the fire, she was gone. In her place was the compass I'd given her for her birthday last year, the one she'd thrown at me during an argument, yelling that I cared more about my work than her. The compass was pristine, its polished surface reflecting the firelight. I picked it up, my hands shaking. "You abandoned her," the woman's voice said, cold and accusing. I spun around and came face to face with the witch. Her face was a grotesque blend of beauty and decay, her red eyes burning with malice. "You left her behind," she hissed. "You'll leave her again." "No," I said, backing away. "You're not real." "Am I not?" She stepped closer, her form flickering like a dying flame. "Your guilt brought you here, Samuel, and it will keep you here." I ran, clutching the compass as the forest seemed to close in around me. The trails twisted and looped, leading me back to the same cursed clearing. The symbols on the trees glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The witch's laughter echoed through the woods. Desperate, I remembered the carvings. Maybe they weren't warnings. Maybe they were a way out. I studied the symbols, searching for a pattern. One set of spirals pointed toward a faint trail I hadn't noticed before. "Please work," I whispered, following the path. The witch appeared again, blocking my way. "You can't escape," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "You'll fail her again, just as you did before." "No," I said, clutching the compass. "Not this time." I hurled the compass at her, and it shattered against her chest. She let out a deafening scream, her form flickering violently before vanishing into the darkness. When I finally emerged from the forest, the sun was rising. The air felt lighter, the crows nowhere to be seen. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the RV rumbling down the highway. A week later, I found the compass sitting on my desk, untouched and whole. I didn't finish the book. Instead, I drove to Rachel's house, compass in hand, and promised her I'd never leave her again. Some curses, I've learned, are meant to be broken. My name is Laura Perkins. I'm 42 years old. This happened last October, when I decided to spend a week alone in Stokes State Forest, New Jersey. I wanted peace, a break from everything, but most of all, I wanted to confront something I'd been avoiding for months: my guilt. Before I retired, I was a paramedic for 20 years. I've seen it all: accidents, overdoses, gunshot wounds. You learn to build a wall, to keep moving no matter how bad it gets. But sometimes, something slips through the cracks. For me, it was a little girl, no more than 10, who didn't make it. I was the one who had to tell her mother. That night haunts me, and it was tearing me apart. The camping trip was supposed to help. I wanted solitude, nature, and time to think. What I got was something far darker. I pulled my RV into a small, secluded campsite near the edge of the forest. It was perfect, quiet, surrounded by trees, and far from the busier trails. The weather was clear that first day, and I spent the afternoon hiking, taking in the crisp autumn air and the golden light filtering through the canopy. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of calm. That night, as I sat by the campfire, I caught my reflection in the RV's window. It startled me for a moment. My face looked pale, drawn, but it was just a trick of the firelight. I told myself I was being silly and turned away. The next morning, I packed a small day pack and set out on a trail I'd spotted the day before. The map labeled it as Meadow Loop, and I figured it'd be an easy hike. The air was cool and still, the kind of stillness that amplifies every sound. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. I was halfway up the trail when the weather turned. Clouds rolled in and a cold wind cut through the trees. It wasn't supposed to rain, but it looked like a storm was coming. I considered heading back, but decided to press on. About an hour later, I saw it. A meadow, tucked deep within the forest. It was overgrown, wildflowers and tall grass bending in the wind. And in the center, leaning against an ancient oak, was a mirror. The mirror was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was large, easily 6 feet tall, with an ornate brass frame tarnished by age. Despite its weathered appearance, the glass itself was pristine. No smudges, no dirt. It reflected the meadow perfectly, but as I approached, something about the image felt off. I stood in front of it, my own reflection staring back. At first glance, it was just me, tired, bundled up in my jacket, hair sticking out from under my beanie. But as I studied it, I noticed small details that didn't match. My reflection didn't blink when I did. Its mouth seemed to curl into the faintest hint of a smile, even though my face was neutral. I backed away, unease prickling my skin. "Get a grip, Laura," I muttered, turning back toward the trail. The storm hit hard and fast. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the trail into a slick mess. I slipped on a muddy slope and twisted my ankle. Pain shot up my leg, and I bit back a curse. Using a tree branch as a makeshift crutch, I limped back toward camp, the rain soaking me to the bone. When I finally made it, I collapsed into the RV, shivering and exhausted. My ankle throbbed, and I cursed myself for not turning back earlier. I wrapped it in a compression bandage and settled into the small bed, hoping sleep would come quickly. It didn't. That night, I dreamed of her, the little girl from my last call. She was sitting in the meadow, her dark hair matted with blood, staring at the mirror. "You let me die," she whispered, her voice hollow and cold. "Why didn't you save me?" "I tried," I said, but my voice was distant, like it wasn't really mine. She turned to face me, her eyes black as voids. "No, you didn't." I woke with a start, heart racing. Rain pelted the RV's roof, but inside, it was deathly quiet. Too quiet. That's when I heard it, faint tapping on the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept to the window and peered out into the dark. Nothing, but when I looked down, I saw them. Footprints, bare, human footprints, pressed into the wet mud. They circled the RV, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the forest felt different. Oppressive. I told myself I was imagining things, that the storm and my injury were making me paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By midday, I found myself back at the meadow. I don't know why. Something about the mirror called to me. It stood there, exactly as I'd left it. But this time the reflection was different. The meadow in the glass was darker, the sky tinged with an unnatural red. And there, in the center of the reflection, stood the little girl. "Laura," she said, though her lips didn't move. "Come closer." My legs moved on their own, stepping toward the mirror. The closer I got, the stronger the pull. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold glass, and then I was inside. The meadow was the same, but wrong. Silent, colorless, and suffocating. The air was heavy, and every breath felt like inhaling water. The little girl stood by the mirror, her face expressionless. "You didn't save me," she said again, her voice echoing in the stillness. "You let me die." "I did everything I could," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I tried." "Liar," she hissed, her voice distorting. Her form twisted, elongating, until she was no longer a child but something monstrous. Her eyes burned with hatred, and her mouth split into a jagged, inhuman grin. "You let us all die," the thing screeched, its voice a chorus of accusations. Faces swirled in the glass, faces of patients I'd lost, their eyes filled with blame. I fell to my knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." The creature loomed over me, its clawed hand reaching out. But as it did, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the mirror. It wasn't crying, it wasn't afraid. It stared back at me with a look of calm determination, and then it spoke. "You did everything you could. It wasn't your fault." The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. I stood, facing the creature. "You're not real," I said, my voice steady. "You're just a reflection of my guilt, and I won't let you control me." The creature screamed, its form shattering into fragments of shadow. The meadow began to dissolve, the mirror's surface rippling like water. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the real meadow. The mirror was cracked, its surface spider-webbed with fractures. I picked up a rock and smashed it, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. I buried the largest shard beneath the oak tree and whispered, "I'm sorry." One last time. I left the forest the next day, my ankle still aching but my heart lighter than it had been in months. I don't know if the mirror was cursed or if it was just my mind finally confronting what I'd been running from. Either way, I found something in that meadow, a chance to forgive myself. Sometimes that's the hardest thing of all. My name is Mark Lawson. I'm 50 years old, and this happened last October. After my wife Eleanor passed away, I thought the best way to deal with the grief was to keep busy. I buried myself in work, projects, anything that would distract me. But that only worked for so long. Eventually, I couldn't escape the crushing silence of our home or the weight of my regret. Eleanor and I had a fight the morning of her accident. It wasn't even important, just some petty disagreement about a missed appointment. She walked out the door upset, and I never saw her alive again. That's the memory that keeps me awake at night. So when the anniversary of her death approached, I packed up my RV and headed to Bass River State Forest in New Jersey. Eleanor and I used to go camping there. I thought being in nature might help me process things. What I didn't know was that the forest had its own way of forcing people to confront their past. I arrived on a crisp, sunny afternoon and parked the RV near a remote trailhead. The spot was perfect, quiet, shaded by towering pines and far from the busier campsites. I spent the first few hours setting up a small fire pit and organizing my gear. Everything felt ordinary, normal. I even convinced myself the trip might actually help. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars appeared, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Calm. I sipped a mug of coffee and stared into the flames, thinking of Eleanor. She would have liked this. She always loved camping, the smell of pine needles and the sound of the wind in the trees. I missed her voice, her laugh. That was when I heard it. At first it was faint, just a whisper carried on the breeze. I thought it was the wind, until I heard my name. Mark. I froze, straining to listen. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Mark. I stood up, scanning the trees with my flashlight. The beam illuminated only shadows, swaying branches, and the faint wisps of fog rolling in from the lowlands. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. No one answered. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overtired or spooking myself. Still, I doused the fire and retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. The next day, I set out to explore the trails. My goal was to reach a spot Eleanor and I had discovered years ago, a small clearing with a stream running through it. I figured revisiting the place might bring me some closure. The hike was uneventful at first. The trails were well marked, the air crisp and fresh. But about an hour in, a thick fog began to creep through the trees, obscuring the path. My compass, a reliable old tool I'd used for years, started spinning erratically, unable to find true north. I stopped to get my bearings and noticed something strange. A piece of paper wedged between the roots of a tree. I knelt down and pulled it free. It was a letter, crumpled and yellowed with age. The handwriting was eerily familiar, loopy and elegant, just like Eleanor's. My stomach clenched as I read the words. "Mark, why didn't you listen? I waited for you, but you never came. Now I'm lost. Come find me." My hands trembled as I stared at the letter. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be hers. She'd never written anything like this. And even if she had, how would it end up here? "Someone's playing a joke," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I pressed on, determined to reach the clearing. The fog grew thicker, muffling sound and distorting shapes. Trees that once looked familiar now seemed alien, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The whispers returned, more insistent this time. "Mark, come back. Mark, help me." Each time, the voice sounded more like Eleanor's. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the trail, but it was impossible. The whispers were everywhere, weaving through the fog like a living thing. Then I saw her. She was standing in the distance, just beyond the edge of the trail. Her back was to me, but I recognized her instantly. The way she stood, the curve of her shoulders. She was wearing the green jacket she always wore on our camping trips. "Eleanor?" My voice cracked as I called out to her. She didn't move. "Eleanor! Wait!" I stumbled forward, but when I reached the spot where she'd been standing, she was gone. In her place, I found another letter pinned to the bark of a tree. "You let me go, Mark. You didn't stop me. Why didn't you stop me?" My chest tightened, and I sank to the ground, clutching the letter. The guilt I'd tried to bury surged to the surface, raw and suffocating. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." The whispers grew louder, swirling around me in a cacophony of blame and accusation. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The forest was alive with sound, and it wanted me to suffer. When I finally got up, the trail had vanished. I was standing in the middle of an unfamiliar clearing, surrounded by fog. At the center was a stone altar, weathered and cracked. Scattered around it were objects, old backpacks, rusted tools, even a pair of muddy boots. It was a graveyard of lost belongings, and the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. "Mark." The voice was right behind me. I spun around, and there she was, Eleanor. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. She smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "You came," she said. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, like broken glass beneath silk. I waited so long. "Eleanor, what's happening?" My voice shook. "How are you here?" "You left me," she said, stepping closer. "You didn't stop me. You let me die." "No," I stammered, backing away. "It wasn't like that. I didn't know—" "You let me go," she interrupted, her voice rising. "And now you'll stay." Her form began to shift, her features twisting into something grotesque. Her eyes burned like embers, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Shadows spilled from her body, pooling around the altar like liquid night. I ran. The fog was everywhere, the whispers chasing me through the trees. I didn't know where I was going. There was no trail, no markers, just endless forest. My chest burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop. I knew if I did, she would catch me. Then I remembered something, a poem Eleanor used to recite on our hikes. It was an old Robert Frost verse she loved, about paths and choices. The memory was like a lifeline, pulling me back to myself. As I ran, I repeated the poem aloud, clinging to the rhythm of the words. The whispers began to fade, the fog thinning with each step. Finally, I burst through the trees and onto a familiar trail. I didn't stop until I reached the RV. Slamming the door behind me, I locked it and collapsed onto the floor, shaking. The forest was silent again, but the weight of what I'd experienced lingered. The next morning, I packed up and left. As I drove away, the trees seemed to watch me, their shadows long and unyielding. Just before I hit the main road, I heard it, a faint whisper on the wind. "Goodbye, Mark." I don't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but one thing was certain. The forest had taken something from me, and it had given something back. I'll never forget the whispering woods, and I'll never go back. My name is Karen Ruiz. I'm 45 years old. This happened last October during a solo trip to Jenny Jump State Forest in New Jersey. I'd been a wildlife photographer for over 20 years, traveling alone most of the time, and I'd never had a problem. But after a health scare earlier this year, I started feeling like I needed to prove something to myself, that I could still handle being out there, away from civilization, reliant only on my skills and instincts. I thought this trip would be like all the others, challenging, inspiring, maybe even healing. It wasn't. I arrived on a chilly Friday morning, driving my RV into a small clearing off one of the park's lesser-used trails. The place was quiet, just the way I liked it. Golden leaves blanketed the ground, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. Perfect for photographing wildlife and reconnecting with nature. As I unpacked my equipment, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. It wasn't anything obvious, no strange sounds or sights, just a sense that the forest was observing me. I brushed it off. Solitude can do that, especially to someone who spends too much time in their own head. I was here to work, not overthink. By mid-afternoon, I was deep in the forest, camera in hand. The light filtered beautifully through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I'd captured some decent shots. An owl perched high in an oak, a family of deer grazing in a sunlit meadow. Still, the strange feeling lingered, an itch I couldn't scratch. It wasn't until I stopped to rest that I noticed something odd. At the edge of my vision, just beyond the line of trees, a shadow flickered. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just empty woods. I frowned, scanning the area, but saw no movement, no sign of life. Probably just a trick of the light, I muttered, more to reassure myself than anything. I kept moving, but my steps were slower, more cautious. Every so often, I thought I saw the shadow again, always at the edge of my vision, disappearing the moment I looked directly at it. I returned to the RV as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger, As I set up my small propane stove to cook dinner, I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, certain I'd see someone or something standing there. But there was nothing. Always nothing. That night, as I lay in bed, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. Faint murmurs, like a conversation just out of earshot, drifted through the thin walls of the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only trees and underbrush. But when I scanned the ground near the RV, my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the dirt, bare, human footprints, circling the vehicle. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found a notebook near the RV. It was old, the cover weathered, and the pages yellowed. At first, I thought it was trash someone had left behind, but when I flipped it open, I froze. The first entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "They're watching. Always watching. Don't let them see you sleep." The entries that followed were cryptic, disjointed. Descriptions of shadows, whispers, a growing feeling of dread. One page was smeared with what looked like dried blood, and the words, "Get out before they come closer," were scratched into the paper so hard it tore. I stuffed the notebook into my bag and tried to focus on my work, but the forest felt different now, darker, heavier. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. The shadows were more frequent now, darting between the trees, closer than before. That afternoon, while photographing a fox near a stream, I realized the sun was already setting. My watch said it was barely 3 p.m., but the sky was darkening rapidly. I packed up and started back toward the RV, but the trail seemed unfamiliar, as though the forest had shifted in my absence. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The notebook was open on the ground in front of the RV, even though I'd left it inside. The pages fluttered in the wind, and the words, "Don't sleep," seemed to pulse on the paper, as if written in fresh ink. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to come from all directions, overlapping and growing until they were almost a chant. I sat in the center of the RV, every light turned on, clutching a camping knife. The shadows outside the windows moved now, bold and deliberate. One pressed its form against the glass, featureless but unmistakably humanoid. The notebook's warning echoed in my mind. Don't let them see you sleep. I fought to stay awake, but exhaustion dragged at me. My eyelids grew heavy, my thoughts sluggish. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of tapping, soft, rhythmic, insistent. I opened my eyes, and there they were, the shadows. Standing just inside the RV, their forms indistinct but solid, their heads tilting as they watched me. I screamed and swung the knife wildly, the blade slicing through empty air. The shadows didn't flinch. They just stood there, unmoving. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering. When I blinked, they were gone, leaving only the faint smell of damp earth in their wake. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I grabbed my bag, stuffed the notebook inside, and bolted for the driver's seat. As I started the engine, the RV's headlights illuminated the clearing and the shadows that now surrounded it. They didn't move, but I felt their gaze as I slammed the gas pedal and tore down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle. The whispers followed me, growing fainter the farther I drove, until they finally disappeared as I crossed the park's boundary. Weeks later, back home, I found the notebook tucked under my pillow. I knew I hadn't brought it inside. My hands trembled as I opened it, and my breath caught in my throat. There, on the last page, was a new entry in my own handwriting. They're still watching. My name is Dylan Carter, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last October, when I took my RV to Belle Plaine State Forest in New Jersey. I run a blog called Urban Legends Unleashed, where I explore creepy places and debunk the supernatural. It's a great gig. Good money, plenty of followers, and, if I'm being honest, a solid ego boost. People love watching me act fearless. I'm not really, but I've gotten good at pretending. This time, I was chasing the legend of the Beast, a supposed monster that stalks the woods. Locals describe it as a towering humanoid with glowing yellow eyes and a guttural growl that can make your blood run cold. I figured it was just another story to scare campers, an easy myth to bust. I couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived at Belle Plaine on a crisp Friday morning. The forest was beautiful, sprawling with dense trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It had rained recently, so the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Perfect for an atmospheric shoot. I parked my RV in a remote clearing near an old, unmarked trail. Setting up my camera equipment took a while, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest felt heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I laughed it off. Spooky vibes are good for content, I told myself. By mid-afternoon, I'd hiked a few miles into the woods, filming as I went. The light filtering through the trees was incredible, soft, golden, cinematic. I got some great shots of the trail, moss-covered rocks, and even a red-tailed hawk perched high in an oak. Everything felt normal until the forest went silent. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling, just stopped. It was like someone had hit a mute button. Then I heard it, a low, guttural howl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. Deep and resonant, it vibrated in my chest, setting every nerve on edge. I froze, scanning the trees with my camera. Nothing. The forest was too dense, the underbrush too thick to see far. Coyotes, I muttered, though I didn't believe it. Coyotes don't howl like that. I kept moving, trying to shake the unease. That's when I found the tracks. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, and oddly human-like, except for the claw marks at the tips of the toes. The prints sank deep into the mud, as if whatever made them weighed several hundred pounds. I crouched down, filming the tracks with my phone. "Not bad," I said to the camera, trying to sound casual. "Looks like Bigfoot's been hitting the gym." But my bravado felt hollow. Something about those tracks made my skin crawl. They were fresh. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was setting. The woods seemed darker than they should have been, the shadows longer. I tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's footage, but my laptop wouldn't power on. Neither would my camera. Both were fully charged that morning. "Great," I muttered, tossing the camera onto the bed. Quality tech, right? I cooked a quick dinner on my portable stove, but I wasn't hungry. My stomach was tied in knots, my ears straining for sounds outside the RV. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of wind set me on edge. I locked the doors and climbed into bed, telling myself I'd feel better in the morning. I woke to a loud thud. The RV shook slightly, as if something heavy had brushed against it. I sat up, heart hammering, and listened. Another thud, closer this time. My mind raced. A bear? No, bears don't move like that. Then I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only trees and shadows. But just as I turned away, something moved. Two glowing yellow eyes stared back at me from the tree line, unblinking. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The eyes were at least 7 feet off the ground, and they didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen. The thing let out a low growl, deep and guttural, and I felt it in my chest. I don't remember deciding to move. One moment I was staring at those eyes, and the next I was bolting for the driver's seat, starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the clearing, and the creature. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with long, matted fur and limbs that were too long for its body. Its face was obscured by shadow, but those glowing eyes burned into me. It didn't run or charge. It just stood there, watching. I threw the RV into drive and hit the gas, tearing down the dirt road. Branches scraped against the sides of the vehicle, the forest closing in around me. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it loping after me, its movements unnervingly quiet for something so large. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually, I found myself back at the clearing. Somehow, I'd gone in a circle. The RV skidded to a stop, and I stared at the empty clearing, my mind racing. How was that possible? I'd been driving straight. I tried to reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, but it had no signal. The forest was silent again, and I felt the weight of those yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. Desperate, I remembered the drone in my bag. It wasn't much, but maybe I could use it as a distraction. I powered it on, praying it still worked, and sent it buzzing into the trees. The hum of the rotors echoed through the clearing, and for a moment, the eyes disappeared. Taking my chance, I grabbed a flashlight and a small emergency kit, bolted from the RV, and sprinted toward the old trail. My boots pounded against the ground, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in tighter with every step. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept moving. Behind me, I heard the creature's growl, closer now. It wasn't chasing me, it was stalking me, toying with me. Finally, I broke through the tree line and onto a gravel road. The moonlight illuminated an old ranger station in the distance, abandoned but still standing. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. The station was empty, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti, but it felt safer than the open woods. I crouched in a corner, clutching the flashlight, and waited. Hours passed. The growls faded, replaced by the soft hum of insects and the rustling of leaves. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside. The forest was quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. I made it back to the RV later that morning, my body aching and my mind reeling. The creature was gone, and my equipment was still inside, untouched. But the tracks near the RV told me it hadn't been a dream. I left Belle Plaine that day, vowing never to return. I never posted about the trip, and the footage I did manage to recover showed nothing unusual. But every so often, when I'm alone at night, I think about those yellow eyes watching me from the darkness, and I wonder if they still are. My name is Maggie Sinclair, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last October when I took my RV to Wawayanda State Park in New Jersey. I'm a travel nurse, and after years of rushing into emergencies and working grueling shifts, I was burned out. I kept telling myself I just needed a break, a real one. No patients, no colleagues, no family. Just me, the forest, and the quiet. It sounded perfect. But I had no idea how quickly solitude could turn into something far darker. I arrived at Wawayanda on a crisp Thursday afternoon. The forest was stunning, a mix of reds, oranges, and yellows, the kind of scenery you see on postcards. I parked my RV near a secluded trail, far from the main camping areas, and set up my site. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. That evening, as I made tea on my portable stove, I heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible, like a breeze bending through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was crying, a soft, mournful sobbing drifting through the forest. I froze, straining to listen. It was so faint I thought I might have imagined it. Maybe it was an animal, or the wind playing tricks on me. I shook my head and went back to my tea. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the sound. It was still there, just barely audible through the walls of the RV. A woman's sobs, quiet but insistent. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. I'd spent too much time indoors, cooped up in hospitals under fluorescent lights. The forest was just unfamiliar, and I was looking for patterns where none existed. After breakfast, I packed my camera and headed for a nearby trail. The forest was dense but beautiful, the light filtering through the leaves in golden streaks. I snapped photos of moss-covered rocks, a woodpecker hammering at a dead tree, and a deer grazing in a clearing. For a while, I felt like myself again. Then I saw the footprints. They were small, barefoot, and pressed deep into the muddy trail. They looked like a child's, though no child should have been wandering alone this deep into the forest. The prints led off the trail, toward the lake. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The path was overgrown, branches scratching at my arms as I pushed through the brush. The lake appeared suddenly, its surface glassy and still. I scanned the area, but saw no one. Just the quiet water and the reflection of the trees above. I crouched by the shore, inspecting the footprints where they ended in the mud. That's when I saw her, or thought I did. A pale face, just beneath the surface of the water, staring up at me. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. When I looked again, the face was gone. I hurried back to the RV, my heart pounding. By the time I got there, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds rolling in. A storm was coming. That night the crying returned, louder this time. It drifted through the forest, rising and falling like the wind. But there was no wind. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that makes every noise feel closer than it should be. I lay in bed, clutching my flashlight, when I heard another sound. Footsteps. They were light, deliberate, and circling the RV. My throat tightened as I strained to listen. Tap, tap, tap. Someone, or something, was knocking on the window. Summoning all the courage I could, I peered through the curtain. The beam of my flashlight swept across the clearing, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But when I looked at the ground near the fire pit, my blood ran cold. The footprints were back, small and barefoot, circling the RV. And they were fresh. I locked the doors, pulled the covers over my head, and prayed for morning. The next day, I found it. Near the edge of the grove, tucked under a pile of leaves, was an old locket. It was tarnished and scratched, but when I opened it, I found a photograph of a woman and a child, both smiling. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know why, but it felt wrong, out of place. I slipped the locket into my pocket and turned to leave, but something caught my eye. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree were the words, "Come find me." The crying was relentless that night, louder than ever. It seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding the RV in an endless loop. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it seeped through, worming its way into my thoughts. And then I heard a child's voice. "Help me," it said, faint and desperate. "Please." I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The voice came again, from the direction of the lake. "Help me." I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the door. The night was cold, the air heavy with mist. I could barely see the trail as I stumbled toward the water, the voice guiding me. "Help me." When I reached the lake, the crying stopped. The surface was still, the mist curling over it like smoke. For a moment, everything was silent. Then she appeared. She rose from the water slowly, her form gaunt and dripping. Her hair hung in wet, stringy clumps, and her hollow eyes burned with something I couldn't name: anger, sorrow, desperation. She reached out a bony hand, her voice cracking as she spoke. "You let him drown." Her words hit me like a slap. dredging up memories I'd buried deep. Memories of a young patient, a drowning victim I couldn't save. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No," I whispered. "I did everything I could." Her voice rose, a wail that echoed through the forest. "You let him die!" The water surged around her, rising in waves that lapped at my feet. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the muddy bank. The spirit loomed over me, her skeletal hand reaching for my chest. I felt a cold weight settle over me, pulling me down, drowning me without water. My lungs burned, my vision blurred. I thought of the locket in my pocket. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and held it up. "Is this yours?" I croaked. She froze, her hand hovering inches from my face. Her hollow eyes locked onto the locket, and for a moment, the air shifted. The weight lifted slightly, and I gasped for breath. "I'm sorry," I whispered, clutching the locket. "I'm so sorry." Her wail softened into a low sob, and the waves receded. She sank back into the lake, her form dissolving into the mist. The forest fell silent once more. I left Wawayanda at dawn, the locket still in my pocket. I didn't stop driving until I reached home, my hands shaking on the wheel. I haven't been back since. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of crying, and I wonder if she's still waiting for someone to find her.